Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. If you are working in the military industry producing weapons, I suggest you go for a new job hunt. It's time for you to get out of that line of work and do something more valuable, okay? Now, having delivered myself of that opinion, I will consult somebody who knows a few things about it, who is Kelsey Gallagher. Kelsey is a researcher at Project Ploughshares in Waterloo, Ontario, or is it Kitchener? I never know. Those two cities are blend together so much. Where are you? I mean, I know where you're. You're in Hamilton at home today, but where's
Calling from Hamilton. Yeah, no, the Ploughshares office is based in Waterloo at the University of Waterloo.
at Nagorno-Karabakh College, right? Yeah. Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it's at Waterloo. Good. No, I never get it straight. All right. So it's good to see you, Kelsey. And I know that you have been working at Ploughshares for a long time, several years, right?
Couple of
And
years now. Yep.
couple of years, and you work, your main beat, as we journalists like to say, is the relationship between Canada's arms export and the nature of the work and the countries that we sell stuff to, right? So you really monitor the stuff that Canada produces that we send around the world to kill people.
Correct. Yep.
All right, tell us all about it. Why should we worry about such things? Is there any reason except for high-minded moral people to care whether or not Canada is contributing to murder and mayhem, or more gently to law enforcement, or some of the other things that require weapons?
No, and it's a good question. Yeah, so I mean, Canada is a major exporter of weapons. We're certainly not in the top five, but Canada's traditionally been seen as kind of a second-tier exporter. So depending on the year, Canada is usually between 10 and 15th biggest, spot 10 and 15 in terms of biggest arms exporters in the world. So if you just look at our population, right, Canada is what, maybe 38th or 39th biggest country in the world. Our contribution to the arms trade, far kind of outsizes that. So the idea, whether or not this is something that should be paid attention to, we would say absolutely, right? Canadian weapons are showing up in some of today's kind of deadliest conflict zones. We've seen Canadian weapons recently in Nagorno-Karabakh, the conflict there, in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, and of course in places like Yemen. So not only is Canada a major arms exporter, but Canadian weapons are fueling some of today's worst conflicts.
Yeah, okay. You've already dropped quite a big surprise on me, because those are a bunch of countries that I hadn't heard about before. I know that the main thing that you guys are emphasizing is this huge contract between Canada and Saudi Arabia for the export of, is it armed personnel carriers?
Light armored vehicles, yeah, LAVs we call them.
Vehicles, yeah, those are, I don't know what they are, but I've seen pictures of them. They're sort of half between a tank and a Jeep or something.
What more tank, I would say, yeah. The current government has characterized them as Jeeps on more than one occasion, kind of in a way to obfuscate how combat ready and mean these vehicles are. These are, full combat ready, armored, combat vehicles, right? Many of them come equipped with anti-tank cannons on the top, 105 millimeter cannons that can blow a hole right through your house. So the idea that these are merely Jeeps or something innocuous like that is all but fantasy. Mm-hmm. So I mean, that's one of the major deals that we look at. This 2014 $14 billion arms deal between Saudi Arabia and Canada, the biggest arms deal actually in Canadian history. But there's a lot of other smaller arms deals. Many of them don't get any coverage, and many of them we actually don't even know about because they're not reported, which is why this work is important, right? We do get data from the government of Canada general data on military exports, we'd call them, but basically the arms trade. But the majority of Canadian military exports, just in terms of actual, not necessarily in terms of value, but in terms of units exported, most of them are smaller components, things like electronics and sensors and that sort of thing. So although, you know, if you're going to hear about the Canadian arms trade, mostly it's going to be tied to these rather scandalous and large deals like the Saudi-Canada 2014 deal. But there's a lot of Canadian armaments and military technology that are leaving Canadian soil on a daily basis.
Okay. Well, I want to hear about all these other countries that you just mentioned in passing at the beginning, because none of them were familiar to me. And I should have my ear to the ground, and apparently I haven't. So tell me, I'd heard that there was some concern that maybe Canadian weapons are being used in Yemen. I don't remember whether you named the Yemen as one of those places in that list. Is it established that the Saudis have used Canadian weapons in that war?
Yes, it has been established. So the two weapon systems, the two primary weapon systems that have been used in Yemen would be these light armored vehicles. So these LAVs, again, we call them, are manufactured by General Dynamics Land Systems Canada, which is based in London, Ontario. We've been exporting these, we as in the Canadian government has been exporting these LAVs to Saudi Arabia since at least the early 1990s. And so Saudi Arabia has quite, you know, a large number. These LAVs that have been supplied to Saudi Arabia have been pictured on more than one occasion being used in cross-border operations within Yemen. And perhaps one of the most worrisome aspects of this is it's not necessarily just Saudi forces that have been using them. Saudi Arabia has actually handed them off to allied security personnel, namely the government of Yemen. And that's where we've seen them used within Yemen actually by proxy forces, but being Yemen government forces. This is an illicit relationship. It's what we call diversion, and it's a breach of the export regulations which Canada must follow. In addition to that, there's been many rifles pictured, Canadian-made rifles. Same deal. These rifles were supplied to Saudi Arabia and then passed off to Yemeni forces. These rifles are made in Winnipeg by a company called PGW Defense Technologies. These are massive sniper rifles. They go up to $15,000 a piece. And we've seen them pictured on more than one occasion in the hands of Yemeni soldiers, clearly being used in Yemen. So these are two weapon systems that we've seen used in Yemen, and this really clashes with what the government of Canada has said, where not only would they not export weapons that would be used in Yemen, but they also have no indication that Canadian weapons have been used in Yemen. Project Ploughshares, on this topic, Project Ploughshares co-published a major report with Amnesty International released in August, looking just at this Saudi arms deal. And we touched both on the LAVs used in Yemen, as well as these PGW Defense Technology sniper rifles used in Yemen. Interesting to note too, also, this company, PGW, just recently, it was last month, actually shut its doors, which is kind of an interesting topic, a bit of a side topic. We're not sure why, and there hasn't been a lot of reporting on it, but
PGW is the name of the company making the rifles.
Correct, yeah. Prairie Gun Works, based out of Winnipeg.
And what do you think it means? Are they closing out, going out of business, or are they ashamed of themselves and hiding under the bed, or what?
I know, I think it's more of the former. They came out and said they are shutting their doors. They're going to go to business. They blamed several things, including I can't remember the exact wording, but it was a poor regulatory environment, which is basically a knock on Canadian export controls. And one of the reasons why it's interesting is we've never come across the government of Canada denying the export of these rifles to Saudi Arabia. PGW exported thousands of these rifles to Saudi Arabia, obviously making a pretty penny when doing so. And then on top of that, we've seen these rifles exported to other countries. As an aside to that, these rifles are also quite popular with sports shooters within Canada and within the U.S. So why they would shut down, I'm not really sure. There's not really been much reporting on it. It's kind of a smaller boutique rifle manufacturer, so it didn't kind of make the rounds in all of the major defense publications, but kind of just an interesting side note.
Okay. Well, now let's talk about some of these other countries that I don't know about. Where's your list again? Start at the top.
So I think I mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh.
Oh yeah, now that surprised me. What business do we have there? I've hardly ever met a Canadian who was ever in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yeah, it's a small place. Yeah, no, I'm not surprised to hear that. So these weapons were primarily targeting sensors made by a company called Westcam. Westcam is based in Burlington, Ontario. It's now a subsidiary of L3 Harris, which is one of the major, biggest arms manufacturers in the world. But this is a full-on Canadian company that's been around for several decades, and they make targeting sensors, which are these kind of ball sensors that are attached to what's called a gimbal. And those are attached to the bottom primarily of airframes, so things like drones, planes, helicopters, and they're essentially the eyes to the ground to target combatants and to shoot smart munitions. So these sensors were exported in large volumes. We released a big report on this about a year ago. These sensors have been exported in large volumes to Turkey over the past few years. Turkey was equipping them to a series of drones, but primarily a Turkish-made drone called the Bayraktar TB2. Turkey then turned around and was using these drones in several conflict zones, including Syria and Iraq. And then, in addition to that, also took these drones and supplied them to militants both within Libya as well as Azerbaijan during the recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, which again was about a year ago, exactly a year ago, actually. So the fact that they were supplying these Turkish-made drones to these conflict zones, all of these drones relied upon the targeting sensors made by this company in Burlington. So therefore, whenever we saw one of these drones going somewhere, we knew that these targeting sensors were also going there. So there's a laundry list of countries where these sensors ended up going.
And in this case, in three or four of these instances, it's Turkey that's doing it, right?
Correct.
This lovely Erdogan government is okay. All right.
Yeah.
And does Canada know that, or wasn't there any kind of limitation put on the contract that this shouldn't be? Well, I mean, I don't even know what is a legitimate use. I guess they might try to make a distinction between legitimate and illegitimate uses, and I can't think of a legitimate use. Well,
sure. Well, from the perspective of the government of Canada, this was an issue because Turkey was violating the end use agreement. So when we supply a weapon to a country, in order for them to receive it, Canadian officials have to be provided with clear limitations on who is going to be the end user, we call it, of that weapon. In this case, it was Turkish security forces, and how they're going to use it. So when Turkey then turns around and gives it to allied security services or allied groups, that's a breach of the end use agreement, or end use certificate, sometimes it's called. And therefore, that's a breach of essentially the export agreement. In this case, there was a lot of media coverage. There was a study that was undertaken in the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs within Parliament, and Global Affairs Canada ended up actually suspending the export of these sensors and later ended up canceling them, which was a big victory for the Canadian peace movement, for Ploughshares, and for the journalists that were working on this story. But I mean, it really speaks to a larger issue, right? Turkey shouldn't have been receiving these sensors in the first place because aside from diverting these weapons, which is when Turkey receives them and gives them to someone else in contravention of an end user agreement, we knew that even before that happens, Turkey is using them in airstrikes that were at least very credibly alleged to have led to large volumes of civilian casualties, right? Turkey was using these drones in ways that they shouldn't have been using them, again, in places like northern Syria and Iraq.
When did all this happen?
Sales usually happen prior to an export, so I'm just going to say exports. The exports of these sensors to Turkey started trending up in 2017. They hit a high point in 2019. Well over $100 million worth of these Westcam sensors were exported in 2019, probably closer to maybe $130 million. And then the government of Canada, it's a bit of a complicated story. They ended up actually suspending arms exports to Turkey in October of 2019 after Turkey unilaterally invaded Syria, northern Syria, going after Kurdish groups in places like Rojava. And then quietly afterwards, Canada ended up implementing an exemption on the suspension that wasn't really announced. And they started flowing Westcam sensors again to Turkey. And then there was the media coverage about the issue with these sensors flowing to Turkey in September of 2020. And right after that, the issue with Nagorno-Karabakh occurred, the conflict there, literally in the days following. And there was another kind of media conflagration. Thereafterwards, a few days afterwards, a couple of weeks, Canada again ended up suspending all arms exports to Turkey, and then ended up canceling the export permits for these Westcam sensors in spring of this year. In terms of the Kurdish situation, I mean, that's kind of a low-level conflict that seems to just be somewhat perpetual. There was, if I'm not incorrect, there was actually a Turkish drone strike reported yesterday in Kobani. But yeah, I mean, there's kind of on and off. There's airstrikes being perpetrated by Turkey, both in Iraq and in northern Syria. Turkey's also been occupying, although I'm not sure where it stands currently, but for a long time, Turkey was occupying basically a corridor in northern Syria in a bid to kind of control, what they would see as the Kurdish problem there. It's complicated, and I want to invite a Kurd or a Turk to talk about it. But the point being that we did see the export of weapons to Turkey increase as Turkey's kind of belligerence in the Middle East also increased, right? So as Turkey got more assertive and got more likely to carry out unilateral military endeavors in places like Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Nagorno-Karabakh, we saw the Canadian arms trade kind of trend up.
Well, Erdogan's character has been pretty clear for a long time, way before 2019. I guess I wonder, what does the law say? I mean, are we talking now about the arms trade treaty and the limitations provided by Canada's adherence to it? Or are we talking about some rules that Canada had independently before that arms trade treaty came into effect? What do the rules say? That this guy must send us a Valentine every year in order to be eligible? Or what is it that a country has to do to be certified as a good guy, good enough to buy weapons from Canada?
Mm-hmm. Well, so just in terms of the obligations that Canada faces, so, you rightly bring up the arms trade treaty, the ATT as we'd call it. Canada's been a states party to the ATT for just over 2 years now. So under the ATT, the arms trade treaty was kind of the first international multilateral instrument to control the trade and transfer of conventional weapons. Under the ATT, Canada cannot provide weapons, cannot export weapons to a country, to any party where there is a substantial risk that those weapons will be used to violate international humanitarian law, also known as the laws of war, the laws of armed conflict. If those weapons if there's a substantial risk, those weapons will be used to violate international human rights law. If there's a substantial risk that they'll be used to facilitate gender-based violence, and so forth. So generally speaking, if there's a substantial risk that these weapons will be used to violate human rights, then the Canadian officials cannot sign off on those exports.
Yeah, substantial risk, excuse me, but it's like beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Isn't that a pretty general kind of rule? I mean, what you consider a substantial risk may not be the same as what I would, or you and I would agree, and somebody else wouldn't.
That might be more likely the case. Yeah, and I mean that's the issue, right? It is up for interpretation, and this is something that we've brought to the government of Canada. Once again, Ploughshares and Amnesty released this report in August on the Saudi file, and really what we were looking at was Canada's failure to see substantial risk in signing off weapons to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia being unambiguously one of the greatest opponents of the enjoyment of human rights in the world.
And it has been for years, and I don't know, maybe always. I don't know.
I mean, they certainly, I don't think, have ever had a stellar human rights record. But yeah, so this idea of substantial risk, I mean, it is up for interpretation. And in terms of how can you get on the list of how do you get on a list of a country that Canada is going to export to? I mean, there's many ways to look at that. Canadian arms manufacturers, they exist in a marketplace. They're pursuing profit, and they want to sell weapons to those who are going to buy them. But also on top of that, a lot of the time provided to discussing Canadian military exports and Canadian arms trade, in conventional media and that sort of thing, is I think mostly focused just on the profit, the chase of profit and generating export markets, when I mean such a large part of the Canadian arms trade is deeply political, and not just the Canadian arms trade is just not unique just to Canada. This is generally the case. Canada is always looking to provide allies with weapons, right? And that's a huge part of it. And again, with the Saudi file, a lot of it is looked at, okay, well, we're arming a bad guy because they're willing to pay us $14 billion. I mean, there's a huge geopolitical aspect to this. Saudi Arabia rather, is frequently referred to as an ally of Canada, right? And the continuity of Saudi control over parts of the Middle East is seen as a benefit to Canadian geopolitical interests in the region, right? Saudi Arabia,
because we don't like Iran.
Exactly. You beat me to the point, right? Saudi Arabia's biggest opponent in the region is Iran. So if we can provide the Saudi kingdom with enough weapons to keep them as a major player, then we are ensuring that Iranian influence isn't going to flow through the region or whatever they think would happen. So as much as this is an economic relationship, it's just as much a political one.
I think that is such an interesting question to raise, because we simply don't ask that question very much. And, if you and I had to decide which country is closest to being our ally, I would have a hell of a time, because I don't know whether the Saudis or the Iranians are worse. Probably I'd rather pick Iran right now, but I don't know, I wouldn't be able to make a good argument on that. Why is it a given, a foregone conclusion that it'd be better to have the Saudis dominant in the Middle East than to have Iran dominant? I'm not sure. I don't see much to choose between them.
I mean, yeah, it's a big question, and you might want to get an IR prof in here to talk about it. I'm sure it goes back to the revolution in '79, and this is kind of decades on decades of history here. But yeah, I mean, it really does kind of come down to arming those that are going to further our interests. But then, I mean, as an aside to that, you have to look at a country like Saudi Arabia and really ask yourself, does this country champion what some would characterize as Canadian interests, right? Again, one of the greatest opponents to the enjoyment of human rights in the world, a country where women can still be beheaded for witchcraft. I mean, just medieval levels of kind of capital punishment. It's hard to wrap your head around. So, I wouldn't answer, who's better, Iran or Saudi Arabia. I would just say I don't think that we should be positioning ourselves close to a country like Saudi Arabia. And on top of that, supplying them weapons is probably even worse.
Mm-hmm. I agree, but then what are you going to say? Let me off the planet. I don't want to take sides in these major geopolitical disputes. I don't know. Certainly, I don't. I don't like the sides we take, but I don't know that I could do a much better job of making peace in the Middle East. But anyway, enough of that. Let's go back to your list. You mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh, which surprised me. What else do you got?
So yeah, so many of those countries listed are related to again this company Westcam, right? So we saw Turkey supply these drones, these Bayraktar TB2s to factions within Libya that were again fitted with these Westcam sensors. And the Libyan situation is particularly troublesome. Not only because Libya has been in absolute chaos for more than 10 years now, since the overthrow of Gaddafi, but supplying weapons to a country under a UN arms embargo such as Libya is pretty much as bad as it can get, right? So we have Turkey breaching the UN arms embargo in Libya by supplying factions in that country with weapons, and those weapons are, of course, Canadian. One of the really disturbing aspects of this too, and this is something that Ploughshares has brought up for a long time, is the fact that Canadian weapons were being supplied to Turkey at the time that Canadian officials should have known that Turkey was supplying these drones to Libya, right? So Turkey has been supplying these drones to Libya, I believe probably since late 2018. I'd have to go back and look. And this entire time, Canadian officials were signing off on export permits to continue to supply these sensors to Turkey, knowing that these sensors were being used on these drones, where it was open knowledge that these drones were there afterwards being supplied to Libya.
Now, when you say Libya, you're talking about in some sense, official Libyan government now. But I mean, it's still a contested area, right? I mean, there are groups that are, well, it's a civil war more or less still, right?
Absolutely, and yeah, civil war would be how to look at it. So the faction that Turkey rather was funneling weapons to was the GNA, and that is generally understood to be the most widely accepted government in Libya. Most of the UN would say the GNA is the legitimate government. That's the word I'm looking for. However, legitimate government or not, due to the UN arms embargo, no weapons can be supplied to any actors in Libya, right? Because the UN has come to the understanding that the supply of any weapons is just going to further fuel the conflict. It doesn't matter who they're going to. So, the UN arms embargo on Libya, if memory serves, does go back all the way to 2011. So any weapons that are filtering into Libya, it doesn't matter who they're going to, is in breach of that embargo. And just to look at some other interesting countries where Canadian weapons are filtering to, we've seen Canadian connected weapons in places like Sudan, South Sudan, more in Libya. And these are some kind of other interesting armored vehicle manufacturers that might not get talked about so much. So when, someone who reads about the Canadian arms trade, might follow some reporting on it, if they think about Canadian armored vehicles, they're going to think about those that we provide to Saudi Arabia, right? These light armored vehicles that are manufactured in London, Ontario by General Dynamics Land Systems Canada. However, there is a long list of other smaller Canadian armored vehicle manufacturers. So, well, most of them smaller, I should say, that really don't get as much coverage. One of them of particular interest is a company called the Streit Group. It's actually pronounced Straight, I believe, though. It's Streit. The Streit Group was started in Canada in 1993 by a Russian gentleman, Gorman Gudurov, who's rather well known now in arms trade circles. And he grew this company quite literally out of his garage manufacturing armored vehicles. At first, they were cash in transit vehicles, so what you'd see when you're going to the bank or something. But then a lot of these cash in transit armored vehicle manufacturers then end up also making armored vehicles for security services, whether that be the police or militaries. So Guterov's Straight Group ended up growing, and it's now one of the biggest in the world. Still, has their original headquarters in Toronto or outside of Toronto, but they have now grown and have a series of different locations, including different manufacturing centers across the world. One of the biggest for the Straight Group in the UAE, which they now say is their literal headquarters. They now export a series of armored vehicles to some of the worst conflict zones and despotic regimes around. And the reason why this is to essentially circumvent Canadian arms controls, right? So just like how there's a lot of banks that are in places like the Barbados, offshore banks, you offshore a bank so that you can circumvent regulations on things like taxation. A lot of these armored vehicle manufacturers, because they know that they can't legitimately export to despotic regimes from Canada, what they do is they offshore their production facilities to set them up in places with more lax arms controls so that they can basically forge new export markets. And again, Straight vehicles have, not only are they in Yemen, they're actually destroyed in Yemen all the time, but they have been supplied to both South Sudan and Sudan, which is just indicative of really kind of how low some of these companies should get, and why we do need comprehensive arms control measures.
Imagine selling to both sides of a fight. You guys fight. Here, have some guns. Oh, God. All right. Tell me about the Arms Trade Treaty and how it works. You mentioned that the UN has made some sort of ban against some countries. Is it the UN that makes a determination about what countries are unacceptable under the terms of the Arms Trade Treaty, or are the particular countries themselves responsible for making that? Well, tell me how it works.
Article 6 of the Arms Trade Treaty places what's an absolute prohibition on the provision of weapons to places that are facing a UN arms embargo, as well as other, if other abuses are likely, things like genocide. So any states party to the ATT faces an absolute prohibition on the supply of weapons to countries under a UN arms embargo. And non-states parties, this is just for the ATT, even those countries that are not states parties to the ATT, still under the UN framework cannot supply weapons to countries under a UN arms embargo. That's just kind of like a no-no. You can't do that.
You mean whether or not they're party to the treaty, they still are not supposed to?
Yes.
What you're saying? Oh, I didn't know you could do that. I thought that if any country wants to stay out of a treaty, they get a free hand to keep doing whatever nefarious things they prefer doing, as for example, with the US and the other NATO and other arms, nuclear weapons states. Sure. Because they don't sign the
the nuke ban treaty. Yeah, treaty on the prohibition.
They can get away with going ahead. But if you're saying that even if they haven't signed it, they still are legally bound by it, is there such a thing?
So no, the distinction here is that UN arms embargoes exist aside from the Arms Trade Treaty, right? The idea of embargoes have been around for decades. Okay. And you cannot supply weapons to a state under an embargo. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Unfortunately, it does happen. Libya is a good example. But under the Arms Trade Treaty, it's just clearly stated also that there's an absolute prohibition on supplying weapons to countries facing a UN arms embargo. So it's basically just an additional layer. But when it comes to embargoes, any exporting state, you cannot supply weapons to a country under an embargo. If that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that clarifies that. Okay. So, but then according to the ATT, it's really then that the UN makes that decision. They just put the arms embargo on, and that's the defining characteristic. Are there any other obligations that countries have by virtue of having signed the ATT that would not apply more generally to everybody because of the embargo from the UN?
Absolutely, yeah. So this is enshrined under Article 7, and again, it's this idea of the substantial risk test. So what the ATT does, what it's attempting to do, is basically put a baseline that all states parties have to follow, right? So if there is this substantial risk that a given country is going to abuse weapons, is going to, let's say, harm or kill civilians with your weapons, if that's substantial risk, the actual terminology in the treaty is overriding risk. The Canadian interpretation is substantial risk. It's the same thing. If there is a substantial risk of these abuses occurring, then no states parties to the arms trade treaty can provide weapons. So it's attempting to essentially regulate the international arms trade, which prior to the arms trade treaty, conventional weapons really famously didn't face many regulations. I'm sure you and many of your listeners have heard that bananas famously faced far higher regulations than weapons when they're crossing international borders. So, and that example I know was brought up a lot when the ATT treaty text was being generated. So this is the idea of basically setting a baseline when it comes to trading conventional weapons to reduce the likelihood that these weapons are going to harm civilians, are going to be used for human rights abuses, potential war crimes, and contribute to instability in certain regions, because we do know that weapons lead to greater instability. So yeah, so this idea of kind of regulating the arms trade, where prior to the ATT, there really wasn't much regulation, and now, I mean, the ATT, we've seen that the majority of UN member states have become states parties. The last time I looked, I think in terms of full states parties, it's reached 110 members, right? So we've passed, well past the halfway mark there, which is certainly a thing to be celebrated.
And at what point does it go into effect? How many ratifications do you have to have for it to come into effect?
Yeah, pass into entry. So it passed into entry in 2014.
So it didn't have to have very many, huh? How many? What was the rule? Is there a general rule about treaties? What percentage of the countries have to ratify it in order for it to come into effect, or does it depend on each? I mean, is it written into each treaty?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, because it seems to change treaty to treaty, right?
I don't know. I never thought about it before.
Yeah,
but now I have the question. I'm not sure.
I'll note that down. No, I'll look that up afterwards. But I don't think that it was many states. I think the nuke ban treaty, I think it was 50, for instance. But yeah, no, I'll have to look that up.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. So Canada was slow. I don't remember why, but I remember hearing people sort of nagging, get on with it. I don't know why we were slow, but when did we sign it?
So Canada signed it in 2019 and fully ratified it. It passed an entry in Canada in September 17th, 2019. So there's after you sign it and ratify it, it takes a few months to kind of pass into force. So we've been a states party for just over 2 years. Canada did take a while to sign on. Project Ploughshares was nagging Canada to do so for a long time. I've been told that Canada took a long time because Canada wanted to get it right. That's what I've been told. In particular, well,
we're getting it wrong amount to.
Well, I mean, arguably we're getting it wrong right now because we're not following it as closely as we should. But speaking to international colleagues, that was the sense that they got, that Canada wanted to basically get all of our domestic affairs in order to accede to the treaty in a comprehensive way. So, I mean, to follow what's required of the arms trade treaty, you have to really update your domestic arms controls to ensure that there's not going to be a disconnect between your domestic controls and what is obligated internationally. So for Canada to accede to the arms trade treaty, Canada had to basically bring our domestic arms controls, which are enshrined under the Export and Import Permits Act, had to bring them up to snuff with what is required under the arms trade treaty. So this took a couple of years. We would still argue, as well as alongside colleagues of ours, that Canada has not sufficiently brought all of our domestic arms controls up to what is required under the arms trade treaty. Again, we go into detail in this co-authored report with Amnesty released in this past August. But things like the absolute prohibitions, I mean, it's not fully implemented, as well as the idea that although Canada now does have a substantial risk test, clearly it's not operating as it should be if we're still exporting weapons to countries like Saudi Arabia, knowing that there's a substantial risk that they're going to be misused.
Okay, well, none of these things are retroactive. In other words, you can't go take back the weapons that you sent somebody and shouldn't have. The question is, was it possible that Canada was dawdling because they were still, just gearing up to provide more and more of these light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia, and they didn't want to interrupt that process? If I were really being cynical, I would wonder whether that wasn't what was behind it. Now, tell me, were there any, in that connection, were there any political opponents to the ratification or even the signing of the ATT in Canada? I believe I read someplace that it all happened, that the sale of the contract with Saudi Arabia was Stephen Harper's doing, and that he takes pride in it, that he still has no regrets. And so is it possible that, let's say, his party or any of his friends and allies were saying, don't sign this thing because you're getting in our way? Sorry, but I have evil-spirited mind. I keep looking suspiciously at people that I don't like.
No, that's fine. It's certainly possible. I mean, the Conservative government, and I don't want to get into too much political waters here, but the Conservative government generally was an opponent to the arms trade treaty. It was under the current Liberal government that it was signed. However, the Canada's accession to the treaty has not really had much of a material effect, unfortunately, on the supply of weapons to Saudi Arabia. None that we've been able to detect. So, if there was some, backroom thinking of don't sign the ATT because then we won't be able to supply weapons to the likes of the Saudis. Unfortunately, that didn't really play out because we've seen the supply of weapons continue, from before the Canada's accession to the ATT to afterwards, right? So it's possible, but I'm not sure how likely.
Okay, well then my suspicious mind turns to other possibilities, that it may not have been Stephen Harper in person, but let's say it's people who have a stake in the continuing production of weapons, the sale of weapons. So here I think of two different sources. One would be investors who may own part of General Dynamics and God knows what other West, whatever that thing is you mentioned,
West Canada.
that they don't want to lose their profits. And so the pressure would be on the government not to undercut their line of business. The other would be jobs, and a lot of workers depend on that. Now, clearly, I think I would be, without even having you here to back me up, I would go on a limb and say that clearly the Canadian government has been extremely reluctant and cautious and hesitant about canceling any contracts that they've entered into. And I would assume that there are political pressures on them, that they think if they would lose every vote in the Sarnia, London, where's it, London area, if they lost how many thousand jobs there. So I think we have to, forgive me for trying to push Project Ploughshares around and tell you
Not at
what
all.
to do. But my theory is that anytime you tell people, you got to stop doing this, manufacturing these damn things, because you ought to be ashamed of yourself, then you've got to also tell them what to do instead, because people take jobs because, I don't know, all kinds of reasons, but they take jobs because they need a job lots of times, and they kid themselves about what the implications are.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, we have no qualms with the average worker, trying to put food on the table. I mean, where the rubber hits the road in terms of the jobs argument, I mean, this has long been a way for governments to justify bad arms deals. Before we spoke today, I was actually just reading an interview with the author of a book on French arms exports to not only Saudi Arabia, but also to Egypt, which is also quite problematic. And he was going into, really smart guy, he was going into detail about how the French government says, well, we can't cancel on any of these arms deals because of jobs. We see the same argument in France. We also see the same argument used by the Brits, right? This is traditionally a way to push off criticisms of arms deals. And I mean, there's several ways to look at it. First of all, when we're critiquing this arms deal, we're critiquing it from the position of Canadian export controls, right? Under the law, under international and domestic law, Canada cannot supply weapons to those actors where there is a substantial risk that those weapons are going to be used to violate human rights. The Arms Trade Treaty and the Export and Import Permits Act does not bring into account kind of economic offsets and negative externalities and all of these things. From a legal standard, Canada has to stop these arms deals. That is just the fact of the matter. We obviously, as a human rights organization, never wants to see anyone lose a good job, right? And these jobs in London, these are secure jobs. Most, if not all, are unionized jobs. However, the position that Project Ploughshares has taken for decades on the idea of jobs is Canada should not be vying for arms deals with countries that there is a risk that these arms deals will have to be canceled at any moment because the recipient is killing civilians with them, right? It is not the proponents of human rights and peace that are imperiling, putting into peril these jobs. It's the government of Canada that is going out and facilitating these arms deals and putting thousands of jobs on the line for deals that legally could fall, apart at any time. That to me, that is peak financial irresponsibility, right? And Canada knew that, and again, this major arms deal with Saudi Arabia was directly brokered through the Canadian Commercial Corporation, an arm of the government of Canada. The CCC did know Saudi Arabia's poor human rights record prior to this deal. So putting thousands of jobs at risk, really, I mean, that should be, those questions should be directed to the Canadian government, not proponents of arms controls.
Well, it should have been directed to them before they signed the contract. That's the point. That's when it would have been a reasonable thing to fight. Once you get the things being manufactured and people's livelihood depending on it, it is true that the next Canadian government, which now is the Trudeau government, has a responsibility for canceling that contract. But you know that the pressure on them is totally different from the situation that would have obtained at the time that the original contract was signed. In other words, Canada had no obligation to hundreds or thousands of workers in the London area to provide jobs for them before they signed the contract. But once they've got the contract signed, canceling it is a wholly different matter.
Sure.
I think, I mean, just, for practical purposes and for political purposes, they would actually have fallout from this, or backlash, or whatever the cute word is these days, for canceling a contract that's going to throw a lot of people out of work. Now, I just think anytime anybody proposes a plan to stop a project that's already ongoing, they should have an alternative proposal in hand. In other words, if you don't like what they're producing, what can you go back to? I believe I heard that before this factory was started manufacturing these light armored, whatever they are, that they had been making trains. 10 years ago, there was a big kerfuffle going on about, it was in the newspapers, that Canada should put in high-speed trains, running from, say, Quebec City all the way to, I don't know, London, or I don't know where it was going to terminate, but I presume it's not economically attractive, or it would have happened. But there's that to me would be a very good argument. You go to these workers and say, I know you don't want to be doing this terrible thing you're doing. How about signing on and saying you want somebody to take on the business of converting it back to making trains?
Absolutely right. I mean, this harkens back to the traditional conversation of economic conversion. So before General Dynamics was General Dynamics, it was a division of General Motors, and which also made LAVs. But prior to that, they did make trains. And economic conversion is it used to be a more kind of popular thing to talk about, I think, during the 1990s. But it's been shown to work, right? In the post-war era, or the lead up to World War II, there was a lot of Canadian industries that ended up converting to making munitions, to making tools of war. And then after the post-war era, those many of those industries very quickly demilitarized and converted back to producing commercial goods, civilian goods, not military goods. Obviously, World War II is a little bit of a unique period in history, but it's an example that we can look to, right?
Well, Seth Klein has a book, I've forgotten the title, but I interviewed him about it, where he looks at the comparison between the way the country mobilized to fight World War II in almost overnight. It was just astounding how quickly companies converted from making refrigerators to making bombers or something. And then the reconversion back to civilian uses afterward. We should make that a very high priority to start thinking about this kind of thing, because we do. I mean, I believe that a high-speed train is actually a very good thing in terms of the environment and global warming, et cetera. I know that trains in general, they don't emit per person, per passenger. They're very low in the emissions, and so it would be a good thing to be doing. But that conversation, I haven't heard anybody talk about it in 5 or 10 years.
This idea that we have to sell to Saudi Arabia, and that's the only possible recipient, which has in large part been how it's kind of translated to the public. I mean, that's another fantasy, right? The biggest consumer of these vehicles is actually the United States, through what's called the Striker program. But we also don't have to sell to the US, right? The Canadian Forces utilizes the LAV platform, the LAV-3. We have hundreds of them. And the LAVs have also been exported in the past for UN peacekeeping missions, right? So if we want to look at a stopgap between arming one of the most despotic regimes in the world, that is fueling the conflict in Yemen, one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes currently, and that's the beginning point, and the end point is economic conversion. The stopgap is coming to the conclusion that we do not have to arm those despots, right? If we have to keep in the interim period producing weapons, then we can produce them for better ends than that of Saudi Arabia or other despotic countries, things like UN peacekeeping operations, to the idea of demilitarizing down the road.
Part of one of the planks in our platform for survival with Project Save the World is the notion of having a UN emergency peace force, which would be controlled by the UN and ready to go at the drop of a hat to any place that looked like it might be in danger of armed conflict. So having such a force with all the military equipment ready would be a wonderful, that's a big ambitious goal. It's not going to happen this week, not by a long shot, but it should be kept in mind as a very desirable goal. I think actually an essential goal, because if you want countries to stop producing and maintaining their own military systems, you got to provide them some alternatives. So what they call security, whether or not it's, weapons really make you secure is another matter, but people would say we have to have some military or police instruments that would defend us. And so if you don't provide it through the UN, then they're going to have their own. And so if you want them to cut back, you got to provide the right thing, a UN force. So if we don't keep that in mind as a condition under which disarmament can proceed, then I don't think we'll be doing anything but spinning our wheels.
Fair point. No, I agree.
Okay. Do people talk that way very much at Ploughshares, or is the focus mostly on just holding the Canadian government's feet to the fire? Do you keep talking about more ambitious, longer term projects such as the creation of UN emergency?
I got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, generally, Ploughshares were a peace organization rooted in the disarmament movement. And in practice, we're an arms control organization. So, something we always say to ourselves at Ploughshares is stick to the technology. Look at what is being sent around the world. Look at what is being produced. Look at what is being thought up right now. And how can we reduce, the negative effects of that, right? So we look not just at conventional weapons, which is my portfolio, but Caesar, our director, looks at nuclear weapons. My two colleagues, Branka Madian works in emerging technology, and Jessica West works in space security. And collectively, we look at the production and proliferation of weapon systems through an arms control lens. So seeing how we can control the negative effects of those, the proliferation of those weapons, or the collection of those weapons. So we wouldn't usually look at kind of longer term goals, like setting up like a kind of peace force or like a civil defense force. Certainly we've discussed it, we've weighed in on conversations, but it wouldn't necessarily be like a big research project of ours traditionally, because we do tend to stick to kind of the arms control lens, which I think is also where we kind of do some of our best work, right? Ploughshares has been around for a long time looking at this sort of thing. So yeah, traditionally we would stick to more of kind of the technological side of things, look at the technology, and see how we can influence those broader conversations within our wheelhouse.
Well, yes, but forgive my pointing this out, but the very image of Ploughshares, the biblical image of beating swords into plowshares, is exactly one of conversion. That
Sure.
is, you're not just destroying your sword, you're turning it into something that is useful and provides a job for somebody, a farmer. Other, even the economics of investment, getting people to go to their bank and say, I'm taking my money out because you're funding and supporting, and you own part of General Dynamics or something. Yep. Well, I don't want to have anything to do with you.
A critical part of arms control is working towards reduction on reliance of weapons, right? So without arms controls, comprehensive arms controls, the idea of economic conversion becomes less and less likely, because so much of our economy, so much of our culture would be tiered towards the production of weapon systems and military goods. So without arms controls, I mean, economic conversion relies on things like controlling the proliferation and creation of weapons. And that's certainly where Ploughshares kind of comes into the conversation. So yeah, the controlling and regulating, again, the production and proliferation of weapons is key for moving towards a world where we don't have industries that rely on the creation of those weapon systems.
Okay, I hereby approve of you. You can keep going. Appreciate what you're doing, Kelsey, and give my good wishes to all the other gang at Project Ploughshares.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Meta.
Have a great day. Bye.
Cheers.